Walking with Jesus through the Gospels. Craig had asked a question last week about why do the writers put something in the Aramaic, the transliteration of the Aramaic, like we saw in Mark chapter 7 and verse 34. With the man, when Jesus came, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephatha. We had that trouble last week. It's one of the tongue-tied, right? All right, that is, be opened. So the question is, why do the gospel writers do that? Instead of just, obviously, it means be open, so why didn't he just say be opened? Because everything else that he's writing here is translated into the Greek. It's written in the Greek. So I did some looking around into this, and here's what I discovered. We don't know.
Okay.
you read commentators, and a lot of it is best guess. But I did find a couple of things that did resonate and seemed reasonable for us to give consideration to. So that is this. It might have been an attempt to express the meaning that they couldn't express in the Greek. Although it's translated, aphatha means be opened. It's like this expression, I can't rightly say it in Greek, so I'll put it in Aramaic, and those of you that know Aramaic, okay, there it is. And it'd be like us if you said eureka. Well, if somebody doesn't know what the word eureka means, you would just you would say eureka, which means I just figured it out, or I got it, or the light came on, or something like that. The writers, they were Aramaic. They were Hebrew themselves, and so they're writing in Greek. And when they're writing in Greek, I'm going to read a couple of aspects here just so that I don't muddy the waters. So Mark's Greek is a rough, strongly Aramaic style. So if you were to read the Greek that he's writing in, you would be like, oh wow, and it's like he's not a native speaker. So it's full of grammatical errors. You say, well, the Bible doesn't have errors. Grammatical errors in the sense of it's not a very tidy kind of a Greek. So think of people that you know that don't have English as their first language, and when they speak or when they write, they might invert something, or their grammar may not be completely what you'd expect from a native English speaker or writer. However, Mark's language is lively and appealing, something like an enthusiastic young immigrant. He's not an immigrant, all right? Just so you understand. So he did speak Greek, but his style of writing of the Greek was less technical. Luke is a much more technical Greek writer. His is a classical style Greek. Luke, there's debate on that, whether or not he was Greek. He had Greek background, but I lean more that he was Jewish with Greek roots. You probably have some scholars. I'm not a scholar, but you probably have some scholars that would very easily and soundly argue that he was Greek.
Because they say he's Gentile.
Yeah. Says he was Gentile? People say he was Gentile. Yeah. But we don't have anything in the Scriptures that state that he was Gentile. So people conclude that based on other circumstantial evidences. So Matthew's Greek is smoother than Mark's, more correct, but still unmistakably having an Aramaic flavor to it. Somewhat like the speech of an immigrant who has mastered his new language, but still speaks with an accent, so you can read that. We follow Amir Sarfati, Behold Israel. And there's times that he's writing in things, and he inverts some of the tenses or puts something in front of the other, the modifier or the adjective or the adverb and so on. And you can tell he's not a native English writer, but he writes well. But not like somebody who's well versed in English as a first language. Now, the interesting thing is Luke has no Aramaic words of Jesus. Neither does John. Neither one of them has that. Luke's gospel is, like I said, is more classical Greek. John's gospel, it's a simple vocabulary, so he's not using extra words to try to express things. So he's more of a down-to-earth, simple vocabulary that he's using. When people are stumped in a language that they're writing in, they'll revert more easily back to the language that they're most comfortable. So, for instance, Aramaic words that you see in the Gospels, in Mark's Gospel, would be mammon. You cannot serve God and mammon. That's not a King James word, that's an Aramaic word. So mammon, loosely translated, means money, but more broadly, it means all material things. And for an Aramaic speaker, that's what mammon conveys more than just money. Rako, or roka, which is an occurrence, you fool. Jesus said, if you say to another, raka. And so he uses the Aramaic in that sense. But there's clearly a more important reason than the use of the Aramaic in other instances, like what we had seen with Talitha Kumi. Little girl, remember what it was? Get up or arise. There's no reason to keep the Aramaic there specifically because it's easily translated as, little girl, I tell you get up. It's a simple phrase in the Greek, and Mark's Gospel translates it into Greek immediately after the Aramaic words. The reason it's preserved in Mark's Gospel was probably because it records Jesus' words at the climax of one of his most shocking miracles, a little girl coming back to life. There's a great deal of eyewitness detail in Mark's account of this miracle. And so when you have eyewitness accounts and Mark wasn't there, remember, who did Jesus take in with him?
Peter, John.
Right, so Peter, John, and James. And it's believed that Peter was the one dictating this letter, sharing it with Mark, and Mark is the one who writes the details of it. So he's writing it down as an eyewitness account. So Peter would be saying, put that, Talitha Kumi. So he puts a number of details in the events, particularly the eyewitness events, Mark does. So an eyewitness would also remember Jesus' exact words and feel a strong urge to record them. No other gospel writer records the Aramaic phrase, Talitha Kumi. Just Mark does. The other ones say, little girl, arise, or Jesus touched her for her to get up. In that instance, didn't even speak as to get up. I can't remember which of the two gospel writers, either Matthew or Luke, spoke it that way. Another Aramaic word that Mark records is Abba, which means? So Papa. We say daddy because it's closeness. I would never call my father daddy, ever. I would never call him daddy. And I would never call my mother mummy. But I would call him dad because that's a term of endearment. The more proper way to speak would be, more proper English would be father, right? But I've never called him father. I've referred to him as my father, but I've never said father.
You know, my father was from the generation where they did call their father.
Yes, and there's a lot of people today that do that as well. So I don't want us to get the idea that God's name, when referred to as Abba, means daddy, because I would never refer to God daddy. I wouldn't refer to him as dad either. But it's this term of familiarity without reproach or without contempt. All right. But the word, the more proper word with father is the word ab or av. But the term of endearment would be Abba. So Mark uses that phrase to refer there. And then there's the phrase that only Matthew and Mark use of Jesus when he's on the cross. And what did he say in Aramaic? Right. Very good job. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And only Matthew and Mark use that phrase, but they immediately translate it and say, which is to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Interestingly enough, it's only those in Matthew and Mark, that's the only phrase that they record that Jesus had spoken on the cross. They don't record the other six, any of the other six. No single gospel writer records all seven. But you take them together and you find out that he spoke at least seven things, seven phrases from the cross. So part of the reason for the Aramaic there is because in the Greek you wouldn't get it, because what was the response of the people? He's calling for Elijah. You don't get that if he spoke it in the Greek. You don't hear it. You don't have the closeness of the two words, Elohi, Elohi. In Aramaic, that and Elijah in Aramaic are very close. They're easy to mix up. He's calling Elijah. But Jesus was really calling on God, but he was calling on the Scriptures, wasn't he? So going back to Psalm chapter 22, verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he knew that he wasn't just dying in place of mankind or suffering for. He knew that he was fulfilling the prophecy, and he knew what was the end result of that prophecy of Psalm 22. So he takes it back to that which is closest of their normal, everyday speaking Aramaic to line up with what the Scriptures were speaking, to let the people know, I am quoting from this passage, but it's not just this passage. I'm looking forward that I'm fulfilling this entire prophecy. And he knew he'd be victorious where in the very last portion of that psalm it says, and to him shall all the proud of the earth bow down. Posterity shall serve him. Men shall tell of the Lord to the coming generation and proclaim his deliverance to a people yet unborn, that he has wrought it or brought it about, or it is finished. So why was Aramaic used by Matthew and Mark? Because the use of some of the words that Jesus himself used was one of the ways these gospel writers verified the events they reported and attested to the authenticity of these events to people, even of our generation. So it lent itself to greater authenticity of the fact that these are first-hand reports. They're not hearsay. We're not just making this up.
It's not 200 years later.
Yeah, where those details would be lost altogether. So hopefully that makes sense and adds a little bit to our understanding regarding that. So with that in mind, let's go ahead, come to Mark, and we're going to go into chapter 8. And I want us to read verses 10 to 21.
Immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they only had one loaf with them in the boat, and he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand?
All right. They went to the area of Dalmanutha. If you look in the parallel account in Matthew, you'll find out that Matthew records it as what? Matthew 15 and verse 39. Magadan. Yeah. All right, so the area of Magadan. Well, does that help us?
No.
You know where it is. Where is it? Home of Mary Magdalene. Where'd you get that from? Magdalene from Magad. Where'd you get that from? Magadan and Dalmanutha.
Magdalene, Mark 8:10.
All right. So Mark 8:10, we've got the region of Dalmanutha. So it doesn't say Magdala there. Deb? How do we know that this is Magdala? Dalmanutha. But where do we get Magdala from there?
It's also called
Okay. So we've got Magadan and Magdala are flip sides of the same coin. So a place called by this. If a rose was called by any other name, would it still smell as sweet? Magdala and Magadan, they're both the same place. Let's have a look at our screen. And I apologize to those online because I realized that things were scrolling on the screen as I didn't realize which transition I was on. So sorry about all that confusion there. But let's have a look at this. This is Mount Arbel, and at the base of Mount Arbel, notice the one on the left, the bigger, the foreground. It looks like a what? Looks like a wall, doesn't it? In a sense. You come down to the shoreline at the foot of that Mount Arbel, and you will have the town or the village of Magdala. So you just bring it down to your pointer. Just bring it to the right a little more to the right, more to the right, stop right there. So that would be where Magdala is, that region right there. We've got our next, you see the building that's on the right? That is Magdala. The white building. Yes. I think that's the chapel. So let's go to the next screen. Here it is, that Mount Arbel looking toward the Sea of Galilee. Of course, the other was looking at it from the sea itself, or from the opposite shore. So Mount Arbel. We're going to be seeing, keep Mount Arbel in your minds, because we're going to be seeing that in just a little bit when we come to yet another map. Remember, Mount Arbel, Horns of Hittim. Okay, we're going to come to Horns of Hittim. Remember that? At least you will remember it when we get there. Okay? So you're not required to remember the names. So let's have a look at the next screen. And this is on the summit of Mount Arbel, looking down, and on the furthermost shore is the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. So that would be Capernaum on the northern part. And then we've got one more picture so that we're still on the summit of Mount Arbel, overlooking the ledge, and just at the bottom is, just in front of that summit on the ground, of course, at sea level, is the town of Magdala. Yes, so that all of that square and the one beside it. So can you circle both of those? Yeah, that's Magdala right there. The ruins thereof. Yeah, so we're going to show you another picture here. So this is looking down from the side, just back from Mount Arbel. And in the square, or the rectangle there, is the ruins of Magdala. This is a picture that we took while at Magdala. This is the synagogue, remnants of the synagogue, that the first century synagogue. So Jesus, having been in Magdala, he would have been there. He would have been in this synagogue. So, we're in trouble. You talk a bit louder. So the seating is on the sides over here. You've got the bema, which is this rectangle box, and this is basically the pulpit, if you will, the judgment seat, the place where they would read the Torah. And just behind there is, I guess no point bringing it because I didn't have a picture of the mosaic, but there's a tile mosaic floor that's, I should have had that up. We do, yeah. And I never thought of it. So I don't know if I can bring that up on here. Well, it won't be up for you guys. I'll look at adding one to the resources of the online, and I'll see if I can bring some up for those who are here in person, so you can have a look at it. All right. Then we've got on the next slide what is underneath that pavilion with no walls. That's what the picture that we had just taken. That's where the synagogue is. So that's underneath that roofed pavilion area. And what you're looking at in the foreground is the village itself. So there's you're looking down on the left-hand side. You're looking down a street, ancient street. You've got shops along the side. There'd be a fish market here. So that gives you a bit of an idea of that region. Yeah, it's interesting that this was a retreat center that some Franciscan monks from Mexico had been building. They had bought the property, and when they started to dig for that area where the pavilion is now, they uncovered some antiquity, some stone, and all of a sudden construction stopped while Israel Antiquity Authority came in, and they began excavations and discovered the synagogue and the original bema seat. The one that I showed you in the picture is a replica. The real one, the actual one, is in the Jerusalem Museum. Yeah. I don't have one up close of the bema seat. I guess I've got a number of slides tonight, so I wanted to keep it to a minimum because our focus isn't so much on Magdala itself. It's just for us to realize that Jesus went over to the other side to Dalmanutha, to the region of Magadan, to the area of Magdala. Keeping in mind that this is the place that Mary was from. Well, we've already looked at that, if you recall, in Luke chapter 8 and verse 2. We saw that there were some women that traveled with him, and of which was Mary of Magdala, or Mary Magdalene, out of whom Jesus had cast 7 devils. So that's our connection with that. So while he's in that region, we discover that the Pharisees, once again, they're coming against him. And what are they demanding? What was it? Somebody say it? They're looking for a sign. And Jesus said, does this generation look for a sign? Remember, why is Jesus not giving them a sign now? He had come giving signs. to the nation. But now, no longer to the nation, it's to the individuals. And the reason for it is that the nation had rejected him. The national religious leadership had rejected him and attributed his works, the works of the Holy Spirit, to Beelzebub. So if Jesus were to do signs for them to prove himself, said they're seeking a sign from heaven, testing him. If Jesus had done a sign, what would they have done? Beelzebub. Yeah. Look, you did another one, but it's by Satan himself. All right. So this is the area in which he's ministering at this point in time. So let's bring up the next slide. So Jesus had been on the southeastern side of the Sea of Galilee from the Decapolis. Remember where he had fed the 4,000? Then they crossed over to the area of Magdala or Dalmanutha or Magadan. All right, so now we find out in verse 13 that he's getting ready to leave and go to the other side. At this point, they're coming back to Capernaum. Now, one thing I wanted to bring to our attention before they launch from there, because I forgot to bring it to our attention, in Matthew chapter 15, Matthew brings another detail in here that Mark doesn't give us. When they ask for a sign, Jesus doesn't just say, no sign will be given to this generation. He adds another detail to that. And he says, this is his response in verse 2 of Matthew chapter 16. So the Pharisees are asking for a sign from heaven. He answered, when it is evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, it'll be foul weather, because the sky is red and threatening. Now, you've heard it said, red sky at night and red sky in the morning. Where did that saying come from? Jesus started this. Now, he didn't say sailor's delight and sailors take warning. That was a later adaptation. But we see even 2,000 years ago, they knew how to tell the signs. So Jesus said to them, you're asking for a sign, but you know how to read the signs. However, so you know how to discern the face of the sky, but you can't discern the signs of the times. What signs is he talking about? Yeah, signs regarding that the Messiah is here. And he says, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. No sign shall be given to it except for the sign of the prophet Jonah. So he's referring to his death and resurrection, 3 days. Absolutely. So no sign is going to be given to you except for the sign of Jonah. And really, that's the only sign that we need, isn't it? So they're getting ready to go back to the other side. Remember, they're going back to Capernaum. And as they're going and they're in the boat, they didn't take any bread with them. So it almost seems like, all right, they had 7 basketfuls that they could have taken with them, but they don't have any except for 1 loaf. Notice what it says. In verse 14, they didn't have more than 1 loaf with them in the boat. So it almost seems like you had 7 baskets. What happened? Why did you forget them? Did you leave them on the shore? Did you put them in somebody's care and forget to pick them up? You had the coat check and you forgot to lay claim of what you had on deposit. What's going on here? How long has it been since they've had the bread? They were in the Decapolis. They bring the bread with them to Magdala or Dalmanutha. Who knows but that they shared some of it, they ate some of it. They've been ministering there for a short period of time. And now they're getting ready to go back to Capernaum. So it could have been they were extra hungry. They ate a lot. And they failed to make preparations to purchase bread or to get more bread to take with them. But why couldn't they just get bread when they get to Capernaum? Because there's places in Capernaum, market, that you could get bread there. All right? So they're not even considering a reason. So it's not that they're forgetful that they left 7 baskets of bread just laying around and Jesus is rebuking them for it. All right? But they couldn't figure out when Jesus says, be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, and they're thinking, it's because we don't have any bread. It's not anything to do with the 4,000. It's nothing to do with that bread. It's they're thinking, we should have been more diligent and we should have stopped at the market and picked up bread along the way. But we're kind of thinking we get it at Capernaum. But Jesus isn't talking about that, is he? Otherwise, it would have been extremely obvious that Jesus could have been talking about the 7 loaves. But Jesus, he's bringing their attention to the leaven of the Pharisees and of the Herodians. More specifically, and of Herod. Did your translation say Herodians?
No.
Okay, so more specifically, and of Herod. More than just the Herodians. Because the Herodians were those that were sympathetic to the house of Herod. But Jesus is speaking here the yeast of Herod. In Matthew's account, he doesn't deal with Herod. They both deal with the Pharisees, but Matthew highlights the Sadducees. So does that mean there's a conflict here that, well, which one was it? Did he say Pharisees and Sadducees or Pharisees and Herod? He probably said all 3, right? The Pharisees, Herod, and Sadducees. I know what you meant. Yeah, I know what you meant. Yeah. So what is he talking about when he says these things? He says, why are you thinking about yourself, thinking that it's because you don't have any bread? Don't you understand? Is your heart still hardened? Do you have eyes and not see, and ears and you don't hear? And don't you remember? Then he calls to their minds, to their memories. I'm sorry, online viewers, I left that on the wrong screen again. I need 4 hands, not just 2. I need 2 brains. No, I need another person. Is what I need. All right, so he says, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets of fragments did you pick up? And they said, 12. But that wasn't just in the last week, was it? All right. So now that's close to 2 months ago that happened. If this is coming on the time of the Feast of Shavuot. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many large baskets full of fragments did you take up? 7. So he said to them, how is it that you still do not understand? Well, let's have a look at the Pharisees. What was Jesus talking about when he said the leaven of the Pharisees? Their oral law. That's a big, big deal with Jesus. Because with the Pharisees, Jesus will actually tell us in Luke chapter 12 and verses 1 to 3. Luke is going to tell us here what the yeast of the Pharisees is. We'll look at just verse 1, and then the context is 1 through 3. Todd, please.
Meanwhile, the crowd of many thousands had gathered, so that they were trampling on one another. Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is
Hypocrisy. It's one of those words, if you start off wrong, the rest of it just follows the same way. When you put the stress on the wrong syllable, We'll all have to apologize for the mistake we just made, or the mistake. Anyway, I digress. So Jesus tells us right there, what is the yeast of the Pharisees? Hypocrisy. So hypocrisy regarding what? For all of these, it's hypocrisy. So it's the oral law. It's their false religious law. They make it appear as though they're very pious, very holy, very righteous. But they're not. They're hypocrites. And Jesus will deal with that at length in Matthew chapter 23. Woe to you, Pharisees. Woe to you. And I think there's, I can't recall, I can't remember how many woes there are. But it's in regard to the things that they've done, probably 7. Woe to you, Pharisees, woe to you, Pharisees, for these things that you do, yet, and then they betray those things by... It's 7 woes, okay. All right. Pretty safe to say it's 7, as a guess. Yeah. So, he's bringing judgment on them because they have an appearance of righteousness. But Jesus has already preached the Sermon on the Mount. He says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you will in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven, or see the kingdom of heaven. And the other aspect is what we've already talked about. He's not going to give a sign to them. Why? Because if he did, even if he did, they would just attribute it to Satan. So they're demonizing Jesus. So he's saying, be on your guard against that leaven of their hypocrisy. Then let's look at Herod here. Herod was very conscientious about Roman law. But he wasn't conscientious. He didn't care about civil law. So as far as being moral, so God's law, he didn't care. He lived however he wanted. And that's what got John the Baptist in trouble with Herod, because he says, you can't have your brother's wife. Right? So as far as Herod was concerned, as long as it is convenient for me, or it's good for me, I will do it. I'll hold to some laws, the laws of the land, but even then I'll try to skirt some of them. And where it comes to the civil laws or the moral laws, if it works for me, it works. If it doesn't, then I'll just let it go. So Jesus is telling them to be on their guard regarding that, because Herod lives, all of these 3 groups of people, they're living by double standards. And then we look at the Pharisees. The Sadducees. They rejected the oral law, so that was a good thing. So they didn't agree with the Pharisees regarding the oral law. They rejected it. But they welcomed the influence of both Greek and Roman cultures. And they opposed the temple ministry, or that they were upset because Jesus opposed their temple ministry, because they were in charge of all of those things, the buying and the selling, sacrifices, the animals and so on, in the temple precincts. And so when Jesus comes into town and he overturns the tables of the money changers and chases the birds and the flocks out of the temple outer courts, the court of the Gentiles, the Sadducees are getting upset. By what authority do you do these things? And they didn't hold fully to the Scriptures because they neither believed in the resurrection or in angels, the supernatural. So yes, exactly. So Jesus later on, he hasn't done it yet, but later on he's going to rebuke the Sadducees. He's going to say to them, come to it here, it's in chapter 20 of Luke. Matthew has it as well, and so does Mark. Matthew 22, Luke 12. Mark 12, I'm sorry. Matthew 22, Mark 12, but we're going to Luke 20 for a moment. Just giving some parallels there. And I mixed them up. Luke 20.
It's confusing us.
I got the shell and the pea, 3 shells in the pea game here. All right, which gospel are we in? So the Sadducees are coming. They don't believe in either the resurrection nor in angels or the supernatural. And they set up this hypothetical situation. A woman had a husband, he died. She married his brother, he died, married his brother, so on, 7 husbands in all. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Jesus said, in response to them, that, see if I want to look at, actually Luke doesn't give that one detail, but the other two do. Just give me 1 second here. He says to them, you're mistaken because you don't know the Scriptures nor the power of God. So that's in Matthew and Mark's accounts. You're mistaken because you don't know the Scriptures nor the power of God. And then the parallel is the same in all 3 from that point on. So you don't know the Scriptures nor the power of God. They think they do, but they reject aspects that the Scriptures clearly speak about. The resurrection, and it speaks about angels, but they deny the existence of both. And as such, being no resurrection, that when you die, you're dead. So Jesus said, in reference to what Moses spoke about in verse 37, Luke 20, could you read 37 and 38 for us, Melissa, please?
In the account of the burning bush, even Moses showed that the dead rise. For he called the Lord the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive.
So not he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but that he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Jesus is basically bringing their attention to the fact, be on your guard, because even a little yeast is going to, or a little leaven is going to leaven the whole lump. Galatians 5 and verse 9. Be on your guard, because a little leaven is going to go a long way, and it will leaven the entire lump. Even to the point that Paul deals with it in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where a man has gone into sexual immorality, a kind that even the Gentiles, that's referring to sinners that don't have any care or concern about God, and ignorance of the Scriptures, that not even the Gentiles practice this kind of immorality. Yet you are here celebrating how liberal you are. And he said, a little leaven will leaven the whole lump. It'll go through the entire body if you don't deal with this now. So be on your guard. Even to the point, maybe you've used this with your kids. Bad company is going to corrupt good character. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33. But that bad company is referring to the leaven and allowing things that are compromises in truth. So hopefully that gives us a bit of a picture, a little better grasp of what this yeast of the Pharisees, of Herod, and of the Sadducees he's referring to. But look how we're left in Mark in verse 21. So he said to them, how is it that you don't understand? Are they left with a rebuke? Kind of. Let's go over to Matthew chapter 16. He says the same things to them in Matthew's gospel. But look at verse 11. Carolyn, could you bring us that? Matthew 16, verse 11.
How is it that you don't understand that I am not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees?
All right, so then they understood that he didn't tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine, the teaching, the way they lived of the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Matthew's account. And it would be applicable to Herod as well. Not that he preached that as much as we practice what we believe, right? So what we live out, that's what we believe, and that's what we portray, and that's what we are influencing with. So they understood. So Matthew helps us out here, lets us know that these guys are not under a rebuke. It's just as Mark ends it, he says, so how was it that you do not understand? He's referring to it in the past participle context, that you don't understand. Now I've explained it to you, but how is it that it's in a sense, how is it that you didn't understand this? So he's explained it to them, and now they've gotten it. And now they've arrived on the shore, and Mark brings us to Bethsaida. So now we're in verses 22 to 26 of Mark 8.
He came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again and opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his village, saying, "Do not enter the village. Do not even enter the village."
Yeah. And why did he tell them not to enter into the village? For the purpose, don't tell anybody. Now, it's not going to keep them shut up because it hasn't worked yet. But what Jesus is doing, he's looking to downplay the emphasis here, because he's working on a personal level rather than a national level. So he knows that he's not going off when he hears this guy telling somebody else going off. They won't listen to me. It's not what's going on here. He's keeping things on the down low. Okay. Why is this? Or we see that in the effect where they took the blind man and led him out of the town to minimize the publicity of the whole thing. But Jesus puts his hands on him, spits on his eyes, puts his hands on him. Do you see anything? He looks up and he says, "I see something. I see men like trees walking." So at some point he must have had his sight and he's lost it. Otherwise he wouldn't have been able to know to explain trees walking. So he wouldn't know what a tree was, what it looked like, to be able to relate it to a people. Restored. Okay. So was there something wrong with the process, with Jesus' power? Was he running low? Of course, I mean, it's a facetious question, right? It's an obvious question. It was nothing to do with that. So why is it that Jesus brings healing to this man so it's only partial, so he only sees partially? Trying to help his faith to grow, okay? Remember, the purpose after the rejection by the religious leaders, now Jesus is turning his attention to his disciples, to teach them, to train them, prepare them for when he's going to leave, and now they will have to continue. But when you look at the book of Acts, what is the title in many Bibles? The Acts of the... Have a look. Is that what it says in your Bible? Okay.
I just have Acts.
Well, what does it? So it says Acts. What is it? Some titles or headings of the title of that book will say Acts of the Apostles, but it's not the Acts of the Apostles. It's the acts of the...
It's
It's what Melissa said, yes. So she jumped to what it should be, which is a good thing. All right, so the acts of the Holy Spirit. Because without the Holy Spirit, there's nothing of the apostles in there, right? It's a good picture for us today that we need to learn that without the Holy Spirit, we can do nothing. Without the presence of Christ, forget it. So, he's teaching his disciples, and the comment was, the observation, was that he's teaching his disciples that not everything that they see or hear in his teaching are they going to fully get. At least not yet. They'll get it in stages. And what's coming up is going to be, particularly in Mark, actually in all three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is going to illustrate that. However, Mark does it, he connects these two events. He's the only one who deals with the blind man in Bethsaida who has this experience of a partial healing and then continuing.
There's a prophetic element to this, that until you see the tree, you're not going to clearly understand.
Okay, so can you explain that? Elaborate. Unless you see the tree. Some will get that immediately, what you mean by that. But what do you mean? Until you see
Until
the...
we get to the cross, you're not going to understand the whole purpose of my ministry. And so when you get to the cross, your eyes will be open, or through the resurrection, basically, the whole 3 days. Then your eyes will be open to everything that you've seen over the past 3.5 years.
And that's what's going to be borne out. It's going to be illustrated by Mark specifically because he pairs these two together. The other two synoptic gospel writers will write the same events, but without the connection of this blind man. It's the same for us.
Until we see the cross, we don't understand what Jesus is.
Yes. And there's times that we think we've gotten it or seen the cross because or seen the whole picture. But that's what's going to be shown to us here in what unravels from this point. All right, so Jesus and his disciples, let's look down at verse 27. Now at this point, we pick up Luke as well. Luke is going to be in chapter 9. But we're not going to be spending time with Luke per se, just so that you know where we're headed. Luke 9. Luke is the shortest of them. And Matthew gives us the best, the fullest aspect. So what I want to do is spend the bulk of our time in Matthew chapter 16. And we're going to pick it up in verse 13, I believe it is. So we're going to flip back and forth between Matthew and Mark just so that we can see some comparisons. So let's look at 16, verses 13 to 20. Who are we at? Todd, I think?
Jesus came to the region of
Caesarea Philippi.
He asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, For this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And now I'm telling you that you are Peter, and on the rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosened in heaven. Then he warned the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ.
All right. So remember, this is private instruction. So they go to Caesarea Philippi. Let's have a look at the screen. They were in Magdala on the northeastern or Middle Eastern, not eastern, the middle western side of the Sea of Galilee. Then they went to Capernaum and then on to Bethsaida. Now they're in Caesarea Philippi. You can see where Caesarea Philippi is in relation to the Sea of Galilee and the headquarters. So Lebanon is here, Syria is here, it's the northern part. Mount Hermon is the most northern part boundary of Israel by the boundaries at that time and even today. But they're not going to remain that when Jesus returns. He's going to expand the boundaries of Israel in an immense way. So this is where they have come to. Why in Caesarea Philippi? Why does Jesus teach them this, bring this up by taking them to Caesarea Philippi? It's intentional. Because geography speaks in the land of Israel. Jesus is going to be using geography and history of the land in order to enhance or to draw from what he's teaching them in the moment. So along the way, when he came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he says to the disciples, "Who is it? What's all the buzz? Who are people saying that I am?" And they start throwing things out, and we're not going to review all of those. Basically, when we come to the next in verse 15, Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" Now in the Greek, it reads more like this, "But you, who do you say that I am?" So it's a double emphasis of you. And really what Jesus is doing here, he says, in contrast to what everybody else is saying, I don't want you to be influenced by the crowds. Who do you say that I am? So this is on their way in the region of Caesarea Philippi. And then Peter responds and gives this response. You are the Christ, or you are the, what's the other word for Christ we looked at? Messiah, the anointed one, the Son of the living God. In other words, you are the King, the Son of the living God. So Jesus gives a response that I think will be easiest for us to see by looking on the screen, okay? You're going to click once, Deb. Yeah. Click. Do you see the dot that just came up there now? Dan Laish. Laish. Okay. So Caesarea Philippi and Dan Laish are not one and the same place, but they are like 5 minutes apart from each other. It's so close that you're right there. Now, what is Jesus doing by taking them to this area? Okay, so you've seen Dan and Laish. It's gone by different names, all right? So it at one point was called Laish, and then it became known as Dan. So keeping that in mind, I want us to go to the next screen. This is an artist's depiction. Now have a look at this temple on the left. And look at the dark shadowed, it looks like a shadow area in behind it. You notice that? And that is the temple of Augustus that Herod had built for the Caesar. And then there's other shrines that are here that are taking place. So this is an artist's depiction, and what is the background of all of this is the next screen. So you remember the shadow I said behind that temple of Augustus? It's this cave. And this was referred to as the gates of Hades. In Jesus' day, see, remember Mount Hermon was further north from this? When the snow of Hermon does melt, it flows down, and it flows through the river of Dan and the river of Banyas, and they flow into those are the headwaters of the Jordan River that go down then into the Sea of Galilee, and then out the southern end of the Galilee on down to the Dead Sea. So during Jesus' day, this was the source of that headwater that flowed out of the mouth of this cave. I think it's in the 2nd century after Christ that there was an earthquake, and the inside of that cliff, that mountain face, collapsed and filled in that basin. Now, the interesting thing about this, the reason they called it the gates of hell, is because they would take a depth not a depth sounder, but depths. They would put down not depth charges. No. They would let down a weighted rope, to take the measurement of the depth, and they couldn't get a rope long enough to get to the bottom. So they believed that was the passageway to the netherworld. So the gates of hell. And this is the area, Mount Hermon. And Mount Hermon, Judges chapter 3 says it used to be referred to as Mount Baal Hermon. What does that tell you about the place? It was an area, even in the time of the judges, that was pagan and idol worship. Big time. Like, this was big time. This was the region of the giants. I'm not talking about the New York Giants. I'm talking about Og and Sihon. I'm talking about the likes of Goliath's brothers. Although Goliath was from Gath, but that's more that he was associated with that region. But we're going to bring your attention to that in just a moment. So Jesus is telling them, all of this idol worship, all of this wickedness and ungodliness is going on here. I brought you here intentionally to say, you are Peter. And on this rock, so Peter is the word, close, Petros, stone, more like pebble. So out of the mouth of that headwater, there would be pebbles, stones that would be pushed along by the water. So I say that you are Petros, and on this Petra, which is rock. But Peter is the pebble. Who's the rock? Jesus. So we're going to put Messiah. So here's the picture. Peter, pebble. On this rock, think of the cliff itself. Immovable. Think of Daniel chapter 2. The stone, not made with hands, that came and destroyed the kingdoms and filled the entire earth. That's Jesus. That's the Messiah. That's that rock. Upon this rock I will build my church. And the gates of hell. So death is not going to stop it. Wicked opposition. Nothing that Satan can throw at you is going to be successful in stopping you. What are gates meant to do? Stop. Gates never move, do they? They don't advance, gates. Gates are stationary. They remain. They're defensive. So Jesus is saying that the defenses of the gate of hell itself will not be able to stop my church, because I am going to cause it to grow. We bring to the next. Oh, that just gives another view of that cave. So you can literally, if you were allowed to walk into that, it's down somewhat, about 20 feet. So it's dry now. It's all filled in. But that's the cave. Right at this section right here, that's just a sign marker to give some information regarding it. It looked like a light at the other end. Okay, no. That's just a signpost. Yeah, no problem. Now, here it comes. All right, let's go to the next slide. This is in Dan, Laish. Remember I mentioned that? This is the gate, the ancient gates of Tel Dan. In Genesis chapter 14, we read that the 4 allied kings came against the 5 kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and there was 3 others that I don't recall right off the top of my head. They came and invaded Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding areas. They were victorious, and they took the inhabitants as their slaves. Numbered among them was Lot and his family. Word comes to Abraham, or at that time Abram, in Hebron, and he brings his men, his slaves, servants in his household, trained for battle, 318 of them, and they made pursuits. And where did they overtake them? In Dan, Lachish. They overcame them here, at this very place, and then brought the plunder back, brought the captives back to freedom. And that's still standing. So it doesn't give you a very good depiction, relatively speaking, of how big it is. Next one will give you an idea. See the ones up top? Those are archaeologists. No, it's not us. We were not allowed to do that. Those are archaeologists. So that gives you an idea of how relatively small they are compared. Like, just seeing that gate doesn't, on its own, there's no perspective.
Yes, so it would have been much bigger than you can be.
Mm-hmm.
What's that thing over it?
Oh, that's a canopy, so that weather does not erode it.
It was underground.
It was buried,
Oh, okay.
and then they unearthed it through excavation. Right. Next picture is a model, just to give you an idea. So the front gate, or the gate itself, and it goes through. So it'll be, I don't know, several tens of meters thick. You can't see.
That's kind of square, right?
That's kind of, yeah, it's kind of square. Yeah. I want to show you one more map, and then we're going to be done. Why is Jesus dealing with here more than what was going on in that day? Is because this was the area of Bashan and Sihon and Ammon. So Ammon is down lower, but Bashan and Sihon, so you see Bashan is here. It's you don't see Sihon in that map, but can you see Bashan? Right there, yeah. Now, can you see Dan on that? So the second arrow from the top, there it is. And Mount Carmon is the topmost arrow. Okay, number 4. Number 3 is leading to Mount Hermon. So you can go to the next map, and you'll see Sihon, kingdom of Sihon. You see the kingdom of Og. So Sea of Galilee just go to the right of the Sea of Galilee, kingdom of Og. So Bashan was the kingdom of Og. Zuzim was the kingdom of Sihon. And Deuteronomy chapter 3 tells us that Moses had led the Israelites into battle against Sihon and against Og. Og's bed was so big, he was so tall, his bed was 13 feet long. Big man. The ceiling it would be a 7-foot here. Maybe an 8-foot ceiling there. All right? 8 foot. So, giants speak about high places, speak about those in the land that ought not to be in the land. They are reminiscent of Genesis chapter 6, the Nephilim. The high places, Baal, Mount Baal, Hermon. And what does Jesus do? He brings his disciples to the very region in which these former enemies, which represented spiritual forces that are against the things of God, against the church of the Messiah. And Jesus brings them there. So in Deuteronomy chapter 3, the entire chapter, you can read about King Og and Sihon and the Ammonites and so on. And Moses and the Israelites defeated them, and Moses said, I'm going to give this region to the half-tribe of Manasseh and to Gad and to Reuben. They asked for it, yes. He was not. So they defeated the Ammonites at Jahaz. Go back to that first with the arrows. So number 1, they defeated the Amorites, sent spies to Jazer, and then invaded Bashan. Number 2, they defeated King Og from Bashan. Number 3, arrow number 3, then they took 60 fortified cities in the region of Argob in Bashan. Then number 4, they advanced as far as Mount Hermon. And then number 5, they consolidated their occupation in Gilead, Selekah, and Edrei. The Hebrews struck down Og, his sons, and his whole army, and they took possession of his land. So Jesus takes his disciples to that region, the headwaters, if you will, not just of the waters, but the headwaters symbolically of the land. And he says, all right, the gates of hell are not going to be able to stand because I'm going to build my church, and my church is going to be advancing and expanding my kingdom and my reach. And with that, we will stop and we will take in the Transfiguration next week. I had mentioned about the horns. Pardon me? So the horns of